What happens when the most feared man in Chicago's underworld is brought to his knees, not by a rival cartel, but by the agonizing cries of his 6-year-old twin daughters? He hired the best to help them. They all failed, until a desperate maid named Abigail crossed a fatal line. The Romano estate sat like a fortress of limestone and wrought iron on the desolate bluffs of Lake Michigan. It was a sprawling, Gothic monument to wealth and power, but to the people of Chicago, it was simply known as the seat of the Romano crime syndicate. At the helm was Alessandro Romano. At 34, Alessandro was a man carved from ice and violence. He had the sharp, patrician features of his Sicilian ancestors, and a reputation that made grown men tremble. He was a widower, a ruthless don, and a father to 2 ghosts. 2 years ago, Alessandro's world was shattered in a split second of fire and twisting metal. His wife, Sophia, had been the collateral damage of a hit ordered by the rival Gallagher family. The bomb under her Mercedes wasn't meant for her, but in the Mafia, intention rarely matters. Only the blood spilled does. Sophia died instantly. Tragically, their 4-year-old twin daughters, Lily and Mia, had been sitting in the back seat of the trailing security SUV. They witnessed the explosion. They saw the flames consume the only mother they had ever known. Since that day, the Romano twins had stopped speaking. Worse, they had stopped sleeping. The trauma had manifested into severe, chronic insomnia, paired with violent night terrors. By the time they were 6, the girls were pale, hollow-eyed shadows, roaming the grand, empty halls of the estate. They would sleep in exhausting, fitful 20-minute spurts before waking up with blood-curdling screams that echoed through the mansion, shivering so violently that their teeth chattered. Alessandro, the man who controlled politicians, police chiefs, and the ports, was entirely powerless to save his own flesh and blood. He had brought in pediatric neurologists from Johns Hopkins, child psychologists from Vienna, and spiritual healers from the old country. They prescribed heavy sedatives that left the girls lethargic and unresponsive during the day, yet somehow the night terrors always broke through the medication. The mansion became a bleak, suffocating place. Guards walked the perimeter on eggshells. Staff members were fired weekly for making too much noise or failing to soothe the children. Enter Abigail Hayes. Abigail, or Abby, to the few people who actually cared about her, was 23 and drowning. She wasn't part of the underworld. She was just collateral in its vast, greedy machine. Her older brother had developed a gambling addiction and owed $50,000 to Mickey Sullivan, a mid-level loan shark operating out of the South Side. When her brother fled town, the debt fell to Abby. The threats became physical. A brick through her apartment window, a bruised rib in a dark alley. Desperate, she reached out to a neighborhood friend connected to the Romano Employment Agency. They needed a scullery maid, someone to scrub the endless marble floors and clean the heavy draperies of the Romano estate. The pay was exceptionally high, standard hazard pay for working under the roof of a Mafia boss. Abby took the job. From her first day, the rules were made painstakingly clear by the head housekeeper, a severe woman named Beatrice. "Rule number 1, Beatrice had snapped, adjusting her spectacles. "You do not look Mr. Romano in the eye. You are a ghost. Rule number 2, you never, under any circumstances, set foot in the East Wing. Those were Mrs. Romano's private quarters. They are locked, and they are forbidden. And rule number 3, you do not speak to, look at, or interact with the twins. The nannies handle them. You are here to clean the dirt, Abigail. Nothing more." For the first month, Abby was a ghost. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled and her knuckles cracked. She kept her head down when Alessandro Romano swept through the halls, flanked by his massive enforcers, his dark wool suits smelling of expensive cologne, tobacco, and something colder. Danger. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his grief and rage, a palpable aura that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. But it was the girls that broke Abby's heart. While dusting the grand staircase, she would often see Lily and Mia being led by their stern, clinical nannies. The twins were beautiful, with dark curls and their father's striking blue eyes, but those eyes were completely vacant. They held hands tightly, their little knuckles white. The nights were the hardest. Abby's modest servant quarters were located on the 3rd floor, directly beneath the nursery. Every night, like clockwork, the screaming would begin. It wasn't the sound of children crying for a toy. It was the raw, primal shrieking of souls being tortured. Abby would lie awake, staring at her ceiling, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the chaos upstairs, the nannies rushing, the sound of a sedative vial snapping, the heavy, frantic boots of Alessandro sprinting up the stairs to hold his daughters as they thrashed. She learned things while cleaning. She learned that Sophia Romano had been a concert pianist. She learned this because, one afternoon, while polishing the brass handles of the locked east wing doors, she found a small, discarded journal wedged beneath a heavy hall credenza. It belonged to Sophia. In it, the late Mafia wife had written about her daughters, her fears for her husband's soul, and the one thing that always calmed the girls down, a specific lullaby she had composed herself, played on the grand Steinway in her parlor. Abby put the journal back, but the knowledge stayed with her, burning a hole in her mind as the nights grew worse. It was late November. A massive storm had rolled in off Lake Michigan, hammering the mansion with freezing rain and howling winds. The barometric pressure seemed to squeeze the very stone of the house. Alessandro was not home. He was down at the shipyards, brokering a tense, volatile meeting with a Colombian supplier. The house was left under the protection of his ruthless underboss, Tommy the Hammer Valenti, and heavily armed guards stationed at every exit. Upstairs, the nursery was a disaster zone. The storm had triggered the worst episode the twins had suffered in months. The thunder mimicked the sound of the car bomb. From her room downstairs, Abby listened. The screams were tearing through the floorboards. It had been going on for 2 solid hours. She heard Beatrice, the head housekeeper, yelling at the on-call doctor over the phone. "They're rejecting the sedative. They're going to hurt themselves," Beatrice shrieked. Abby threw off her thin blanket. She couldn't take it anymore. The desperate instinct of a protector, an instinct she didn't even know she possessed, overrode her fear of the Romano syndicate. She slipped out of her room, wearing only a plain white cotton nightgown, her bare feet silent on the freezing hardwood. She crept up the servants' stairs, avoiding the main landings where Tommy Valenti's guards were pacing. She reached the 2nd-floor nursery. The door was ajar. Beatrice was frantically pacing in the hallway, screaming into her cell phone, trying to reach Alessandro. Inside the dimly lit room, the 2 nannies were trying to physically restrain the thrashing 6-year-olds. The girls were hyperventilating, their faces flushed, their eyes wide with sheer terror, lost in a memory of fire and blood. Abby didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked into the room. "What are you doing here?" one of the nannies barked. "Get out, cleaner." Abby ignored her. She walked straight to the beds. There was something in her posture, a quiet, resolute calm, that momentarily stunned the nannies. Abby knelt beside the bed. She didn't try to grab the girl's flailing arms. Instead, she began to hum. Softly at first, a strange, haunting melody she had memorized from the sheet music tucked into Sophia's journal. Lily stopped thrashing for a fraction of a second. Mia's terrified eyes darted toward Abby. "I need to take them," Abby said, her voice steady. "Are you insane?" Beatrice had stepped back into the room, her face pale with fury. "If you touch them, Mr. Romano will have you buried under the lake." "They need their mother's room," Abby said, standing up and grabbing 2 thick cashmere blankets. Before the shocked staff could physically stop her, Abby scooped Lily into her left arm and grabbed Mia's hand with her right. The girls, completely disoriented but suddenly captivated by the humming, didn't resist. They clung to her. "Stop her! Guards!" Beatrice shrieked. Abby bolted. She ran down the grand corridor, carrying the heavy 6-year-old and dragging the other. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Armed men in suits were charging up the stairs. She veered left, heading straight for the forbidden east wing. 2 massive oak doors stood at the end of the hall, sealed shut with a heavy brass padlock. Abby didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy, bronze bust of a Roman emperor from a side table and smashed it against the padlock. Once. Twice. The metal groaned. The guards were at the end of the hall now, guns drawn, shouting orders. Crash. The lock gave way. Abby pushed the heavy doors open and dragged the girls inside, slamming the door shut behind them and throwing the heavy iron deadbolt just as the guards slammed into the wood from the outside. "Open this door, you crazy bitch!" Tommy Valenti roared from the hallway, pounding his fists against the oak. "I swear to God, I'll put a bullet in your head!" Abby ignored the violent threats echoing behind her. She turned to look at the room. It was perfectly preserved, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. The twins were trembling, looking around. The twins were trembling, looking around the room they hadn't seen since they were 4. Tears welled up in their eyes. Abby sat them down on the velvet sofa. She walked over to the piano, lifted the heavy lid, and sat on the bench. Her hands were shaking violently. She had learned to play on a broken keyboard in a cramped apartment, entirely self-taught. She prayed her fingers would remember the keys. Outside, she could hear the screeching of tires on the gravel driveway below. Alessandro was back. The front doors burst open, and a chorus of panicked voices erupted downstairs. Abby pressed her fingers to the ivory keys. She began to play Sophia's lullaby. The music filled the dusty, suffocating air of the East Wing. It was a melancholy, beautiful tune, weaving a tapestry of warmth and safety. Almost instantly, the chaotic energy in the room dissolved. Lily and Mia stared at Abby, their chests heaving as the melody washed over them. The music wrapped around their shattered little minds like a warm embrace. Slowly, miraculously, the terror faded from their eyes. Mia walked over to the piano bench and leaned her head against Abby's side. Lily followed, crawling up onto the bench to rest her head on Abby's lap. Abby kept playing, tears falling from her own eyes, softly humming the melody. Within minutes, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep filled the air. The twins had finally surrendered. Suddenly, a deafening crash shattered the peace. The heavy oak doors were violently kicked open, splintering the doorframe. Alessandro Romano stood in the threshold, completely drenched in freezing rain, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. In his right hand, he gripped a black Beretta 9mm, leveled directly at Abby's chest. Behind him stood a dozen heavily armed men, ready to tear the room apart. "Step away from my daughters." Alessandro's voice was a lethal, quiet hiss that cut through the silence like a razor blade. Abby froze. Her hands hovered over the keys. Her heart hammered against her ribs, entirely sure that she was about to take her last breath. But as Alessandro stepped into the room, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes fell upon the piano bench. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, draped over the lap of a trembling, barefoot maid, his 2 daughters were fast asleep. No thrashing, no screaming, just the peaceful, unbroken sleep of innocent children, something he hadn't seen in 2 excruciating years. Alessandro's hand began to shake. The gun slowly, agonizingly, lowered to his side. The ruthless Mafia don stared at the poor scullery maid, the silence of the room broken only by the steady rain against the glass and the soft breathing of his sleeping angels. The unthinkable had happened, and Abby's life within the Romano family was about to change forever. The silence in the East Wing was so heavy it felt physical. Alessandro Romano, a man who had ordered the deaths of dozens without blinking, looked as though he had seen a ghost. His eyes traveled from the sleeping faces of Lily and Mia to the trembling hands of Abigail. The gun in his hand felt suddenly heavy, an instrument of death in a room that had just rediscovered life. "How?" Alessandro whispered, his voice cracking, a sound his underboss, Tommy Valenti, had never heard in 15 years of service. Abigail didn't move. She kept her hands on the keys, terrified that if the music stopped, the nightmare would resume. "Your wife?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible over the rain. "She left a journal. She wrote about the music. They just needed to hear her again." "Mr. Romano." Tommy stepped forward, his face twisted in a snarl. "Boss." She broke into the East Wing. She smashed the lock. She could have been an assassin, a plant from the Gallaghers. Let me take her downstairs and find out who she's really working for. Alessandro raised a hand, silencing his second-in-command instantly. He walked slowly toward the piano, his boots clicking softly on the hardwood. He looked at Abigail, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the cheap, frayed nightgown, the dirt under her fingernails from scrubbing his floors, and the raw, honest terror in her wide brown eyes. He also saw the way his daughters clung to her, their breathing rhythmic and deep. "Leave us," Alessandro commanded, not taking his eyes off Abigail. "But boss," Tommy started. "Out!" Alessandro roared. The room cleared in seconds. The heavy doors were pulled shut, leaving the Mafia don and the maid in the soft glow of the moonlight. Alessandro sat on the edge of a silk-covered armchair, burying his face in his hands. The monster of Chicago looked, for a brief moment, like a broken man. "They haven't slept like that since the funeral," he said to the floor. "The doctors said their brains were stuck in a loop, a trauma response that couldn't be broken." "They weren't stuck, sir," Abigail said softly, gaining a spark of courage. "They were lonely. They were surrounded by guards and doctors, but they were missing the one thing that made them feel safe. They didn't need medicine. They needed a memory." Alessandro looked up. The coldness was returning to his eyes, but it wasn't directed at her. It was a calculating, possessive coldness. "You are Abigail Hayes. Your brother is Liam Hayes. He owes 50,000 to Sullivan." Abigail gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "How do you—" "I know everyone who breathes under my roof, Abigail. I knew you were a risk the moment you were hired. I didn't know you were a miracle." He stood up and walked toward her. He reached out, and for a second, she flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, his thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek. "Sullivan works for me. Your brother's debt is erased. Consider it a down payment." "A down payment for what?" "From this moment, you are no longer a maid," Alessandro stated, his voice regaining its iron authority. "You are the twins' governess. You will move into the suite adjacent to theirs. You will eat with them. You will play that piano every night. And in exchange, I will protect you from the world. But make no mistake, Abigail, you belong to this house now. You don't leave without my permission. You don't speak to anyone outside these walls. You are the key to my daughter's sanity, and I do not lose my keys." Abigail realized then that she had traded one debt for another. She was no longer hunted by a lone shark, but she was now the personal property of a kingpin. The following weeks were a surreal blur. Abigail was moved into a room filled with silks and fine linens. She was given a wardrobe of designer clothes, though she felt like a fraud wearing them. The twins, Lily and Mia, became her shadow. They still didn't speak, but they smiled. They laughed. They held her hands as they walked through the gardens. But as the girls thawed, so did the ice around Alessandro's heart. He began to appear at dinner. He would watch Abigail from the doorways, his intense gaze following her every move. The tension between them grew, a dangerous, magnetic pull. Abigail knew he was a violent man, a man whose hands were stained with blood. Yet she saw the way he looked at his daughters. She saw the soul behind the scars. One evening, while the girls were napping, Alessandro found Abigail in the library. He trapped her between his arms against a bookshelf, the scent of expensive bourbon and cedarwood enveloping her. "You're changing this house, Abigail," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "You're making me remember things I spent years trying to forget. You're making me feel human." Abigail's breath hitched. "Is that a bad thing, Alessandro?" "In my world, feeling is a death sentence," he whispered. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "The Gallaghers are moving on the west side. They know I've found a weakness. They think you're my soft spot." "Am I?" she asked, her heart hammering. Alessandro pulled back, his eyes dark with a hunger that terrified and thrilled her. "You're not a soft spot, Abigail. You're the only thing worth fighting for." But the peace was a lie. The unthinkable act of breaking into the East Wing had set off a chain reaction. Someone within the house, someone high up, had leaked the information to the Gallagher clan. They knew the Don was distracted by a common Maid. They knew exactly when to strike. The attack happened during the twins' 7th birthday celebration. Alessandro had gone against his better judgment and allowed a small party on the estate grounds. He wanted his daughters to have a normal life, a dream Abigail had planted in his head. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. Abigail was adjusting a pink bow in Mia's hair when the first shot rang out. A high-powered rifle round shattered a crystal punch bowl just feet away. "Get down!" Alessandro bellowed, diving across the grass to tackle Abigail and the twins as a hail of gunfire erupted from the tree line. The estate guards returned fire immediately, but they were caught off guard. Black SUVs breached the main gates, ramming through the security detail. It was a full-scale invasion. "Tommy, get them to the bunker!" Alessandro screamed, handing the twins to his underboss. But Tommy Valenti didn't move toward the house. He stood still, a cold, treacherous smile spreading across his face as he pulled his own weapon and pointed it at Alessandro. "Sorry, boss," Tommy said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The Gallaghers offered me the throne. You've gone soft. You're letting a maid run the Romano Empire. It ends today." Abigail screamed as Tommy pulled the trigger. Alessandro rolled, the bullet grazing his shoulder. In the chaos, Gallagher's men swarmed the lawn. Abigail grabbed the twins, her maternal instincts screaming. She didn't head for the bunker. She knew Tommy would be waiting there. She headed for the one place no one would expect, the cliffside boathouse. She ran through the woods, the twins sobbing as they stumbled over roots. Behind them, the sounds of war echoed. Grenades, rapid gunfire, and the shouts of dying men. She reached the boathouse and hid the girls inside a storage locker, whispering to them to stay silent no matter what. She turned to lock the door, but a hand grabbed her hair and flung her against the wall. It was Tommy. "Where are the brats, Abigail?" he hissed, his face splattered with blood. "I need them as leverage to make sure the rest of the capos fall in line." "Go to hell," Abigail spat, reaching for a heavy boat hook on the wall. Tommy laughed, raising his gun. "You really thought you were part of this family? You're just a maid who got lucky." Before he could pull the trigger, a shadow loomed in the doorway. Alessandro appeared like a vengeful god, his suit torn, blood dripping from a wound on his forehead. He didn't say a word. He tackled Tommy with the force of a freight train. The fight was brutal and primal. They crashed through the wooden railing of the boathouse, tumbling onto the jagged rocks below as the waves of the lake crashed against the shore. Abigail ran to the edge, screaming Alessandro's name. Below in the moonlight, she saw the two men struggling. Tommy had a knife, but Alessandro had something stronger, a father's rage. With a guttural roar, Alessandro snapped Tommy's wrist and drove the traitor's own blade into his chest. Alessandro slumped against a rock, gasping for air as the Gallagher reinforcements were finally being pushed back by the loyalist Romano guards up the hill. Abigail scrambled down the rocks, reaching him just as he was losing consciousness. She cradled his head in her lap, pressing her hand to his bleeding shoulder. "The girls," he wheezed. "Safe," she sobbed. "They're safe because of you." "No," Alessandro whispered, reaching up to touch her face. "They're safe because of you. You saved them from the dark, and you saved me from myself." 1 year later, the Romano estate was no longer a fortress of silence. Music drifted through the open windows, not just the melancholy lullaby of a ghost, but the bright, upbeat scales of two young girls practicing their lessons. Alessandro stood on the terrace, a scar running down his temple, watching his daughters play on the lawn. Beside him stood Abigail. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform or a borrowed dress. She wore a diamond ring that caught the sunlight, a symbol of a new kind of alliance. The Chicago underworld still feared the name Romano, but the man behind the name was different. He was no longer a widower haunted by the past. He was a man protected by a love that had started with a forbidden song. Abigail looked at him and smiled. She had come to this house to pay a debt of money, but she had ended up earning a debt of blood and devotion. The poor maid had done the unthinkable. She had tamed the beast and given the sleepless angels their wings. In the shadows of power, love is the most dangerous weapon of all. Abigail went from scrubbing floors to ruling a heart of stone, proving that even in the world of the Mafia, hope can never be silenced. If this story of grit, passion, and betrayal kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark romance dramas. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances. What would you have done in Abigail's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.